Hi, I'm Gwynnyd, and this is my all-thumbs guide to hand sewing. The things you're going to need for this class are a piece of plain material. This one's about 10 by 12, about a foot square. You'll need sewing needles. Just one will do, but this is a pack. Some kind of scissors or snips. 3 pins. These are different styles, but you can do anything, any kind. A needle threader, a piece of wax, and thread. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our needle. We're going to talk about, well, first we're going to talk about needles, just a little bit. There's all different kinds of needles. These are described in the class handouts as well. You can see there's all different kinds. They're different lengths, different size eyes, which is a little hole on the top. For different, they're used for different things. Mostly they're sharps. Embroidery needles have the biggest eyes, or betweens, which are the kind of like medium-sized ones. For this class, any kind of needle will work. I'm using a fairly large-eyed sharp here, and we're going to take thread. And the thread you want to use is a cotton or a cotton polyester thread. They can either come on a spool like this or a spool like this. This is actually carpet thread that I'm going to be using for the demonstration. It's really thick, so you can see what I'm doing. I would recommend using regular thread for this course. So first you're going to take a piece about a foot long and snip it. And if you have a piece of wax, this is really important. You can use a piece of wax, or you can use either one of this kind of candle. This is a real wax candle, and this is just an emergency candle that's paraffin. I recommend using a light color candle if you're going to use a paraffin one, because I have no idea what the color would do to your thread. So in order to do hand sewing properly, you need to wax the thread. So we're going to just lay the thread on the wax and pull it under our thumb, both directions. And this just puts a nice light layer of wax on it, and it's going to make it glide through the fabric and make it much, much easier to thread. If your end is a little fuzzy, you can just do this several times on the end and it'll stiffen up nice. If you don't have wax, just lick it a little bit. If you have a needle threader, the way that works is to take the little wire loop on the needle and slide it through the eye. Oops, come on, get it through the eye. It's an odd angle for me. And then you take your thread and you put it through the big hole in your wire and gently pull it back through the eye of the needle. I've got to really pull on this because this is really thick thread. Usually it comes through easier. Say, if you don't have a needle threader, your wax thread should just kind of glide fairly easily through the hole in your needle. And of course it's, there we go. To just pull it through. Now to knot a thread, because I know you're all going to want to know how to knot a thread, you take the thread and you wrap it around your finger like this, and you just kind of roll it down between your thumb until it rolls up and pull down. And that puts a nice little tiny knot at the end of the thread. And you can just trim that off. This is the first stitch we're going to do is a running stitch. This is worked from the dominant hand side to the non-dominant hand side. And I say that because you can work this, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to work from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. If you're left-handed, your dominant side would be your left-hand side, and you would be working it this way across the fabric. So starting at on your dominant side, take the needle with the knot on, the thread with the knot on it, and put it through the edge, fairly close to the edge and about a ½ inch down, and gently pull it through until it runs up against the knot. To take the first stitch, move over just a little ways and put the needle in, but not all the way down. Then you want to rotate the needle to the non-dominant side and slide it back out. At that point, you just pull it gently through, and there you've got your first stitch. And then you just repeat that. You move over about the same distance that you've got here, and you insert the needle again and rotate it and push it out and pull it through. Now, because I've got a longer needle here, and most of you be sewing with a longer needle, you can do several stitches at once. You don't have to pull it through every time. So I put it down and rotate it out and put it down and rotate it out. And you see I can kind of push the fabric together so I can get more of it on the needle. And your goal is to make your stitches all the same size and about at the same spot. So don't worry about too much about getting it absolutely perfect. You can see mine isn't absolutely perfect. This is just to practice, and getting it more even will just come with practice as you do it. So in and out and in and out. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. You don't have to knot your threads. The best hand sewers never knot their threads. What they do is they take the needle and they make two little stitches. Two little running stitches like that, but really, really tiny, right in the same spot. 1, 2. And then I'm just going to hide the end of this on the back where the other knot was. I'm just going to push it through. And I'm going to trim off the end just a little bit, like that. Now that's going to hold. You can put that through the wash. You can do anything. That's not going to come out, and it's much flatter. If you run your finger over this, you'll see that it's not as lumpy as where you have a knot. So to start the next thread, you just kind of do the same two little stitches. Oops, I should start from the back. So we hide that beginning tail. Take another little stitch. Now, and if you get to the point where your thread is doubled over, because you're only doing this with a single thread, never do it with a double thread. Just tug a little bit on your needle till it slides up till it's single. And then you just go back to your in and out, in and out, in and out, all the way across. And you can use this for putting two pieces of fabric together. It's not a very strong seam, but if you're just like trying something on to see if it fits, this is like a lovely basting stitch to hold it together. You can sew down trim with this stitch, or you can use it literally as a gathering stitch. Like if you're doing a skirt into a waistband, you can just use it to pull it up into a gather like that and then sew it down at that point. So I'm just going to quickly finish this all off to the end. And you can see how fast it goes. And you can work really hard at making these even, or you can just be like me, what I'm doing now, and just kind of run it through roughly. And it works either way, depending on whether you're doing it decorative or on the inside. And again, I'm going to stretch this up to a single thread. Just pull it through. And when I get to the end, I'm going to do my two little stitches, and I'm just going to lock it down that way. However, if you don't trust the little stitches and you want to put a knot in, you put the thread to the back, and you take another little stitch, a little tiny stitch, or just run it through the little stitches that are there. And when you get a loop on your fabric, like this, you slide the needle up through the loop, and you pull it tight. You can see it's kind of making a little knot there. And you pull it tight, and if you do that twice, that is never going to come out. And that kind of a knot does not have to have a tail on it. You can cut it off right at the end. Stitch. Again, I have a threaded needle that I'm working single threaded, so one side here is shorter than the other. And I'm going to start on the back about a ½ inch down Now this stitch is worked from the non-dominant side, which is my left side, toward my dominant side, which for me is my right side. If you're left-handed, it's going to be the other way around. So you start the stitch on pretty close to the non-dominant side, and I'm going to do this with 2 little stitches right at the end. I'm going to take 1 little stitch there to hold that in place, and 1 more to lock it down. Now we're going to take this and do a running stitch from the same direction that you did the running stitch, but starting on the non-dominant side. So I'm going to move over from where I knotted it, about the length of a running stitch, and I'm going to put the needle in, and I'm going to come up in the same hole where I'm knotting it. So I have my loop of thread down. It's very important to always keep the thread down towards you on this stitch. And I'm going to pull this through. So I have 1 little running stitch at the end. Now to make the second stitch in the back stitch, again making sure the fabric stays down towards you, you move over again about the length of a running stitch, and again you come up in the same hole where you went down in the first stitch. So you're working back toward it. That's why it's called a back stitch. So when I pull this one through, I'm trying to do this very carefully here. This really heavy thread kind of kinks. There we go. Okay, now I've got a place where I've got two strands of thread here, and then I have a single strand of thread that sticks out about half the distance of the stitch. So I take my next stitch, again I move over toward my dominant side, and come back toward my non-dominant side, and come up again in the same hole. So you can see I'm just kind of looping this around, so that's why it's so important to keep the thread underneath so it doesn't tangle. Now you can see this stitch covers a whole lot more fabric than the running stitch does, and because you've got the thread going both ways through the hole, it's a much stronger stitch. So if you're doing the seam, I recommend using something like the running stitch here, the back stitch here, rather than the running stitch. This one also works very well if you're doing embroidery for like outlining pictures or doing stems, which is why it's called a stem stitch. And so you just move towards your dominant side and come back up in the same hole that you went down in on the previous stitch. So my next stitch over, this is the hole that I'll be coming up in. You can see I'm coming up in that hole there. And I'll do 1 more stitch. And you should just do this all the way to the other side. And that's how you do a back stitch. Okay, I've finished the whole row of back stitch here. So when I get to the end, I'm just going to slide the needle back down the same hole here and pull it to the back and do my 2 little locking stitches to hold it in place, and then I can cut it off. Actually, for this one, its needle's so short, I'm just going to pull it right off the thread and leave a little tail there. Now for the next, these 2 stitches are seam stitches. This can be used to hold 2 pieces of fabric together. This is a much stronger way to hold 2 pieces of fabric together. The next 3 stitches we're going to do are hem stitches. So in order to simulate this being a hem, we're going to take a little pleat in this, right about here, and fold it up about a 1/2 inch under. So we have a little pleat on the side like that. And this is where you want to use your pins, and just put them in at the bottom of the fold. I'll go along here trying to get this kind of straight. If you're not using pins, it's perfectly okay just to press this down with your fingers, or if you have access to an iron, you could just iron the pleat into place. If you're doing a hem, you're probably better off ironing it anyway. And that's how we're going to get started up to do our hem stitches. Okay, these are going to be, the next 3 stitches are going to be hem stitches. The first one is just called a slip stitch. This is the one you've probably seen on every hem that you've ever done. So to start this one, you want to, again, this is going to be worked from the non-dominant side towards your dominant side. So I'm going to start over on my left-hand side here, and I'm going to take just a couple of little stitches on the inside to hold it in place. Leaving a little tail there, and another stitch. Okay, so that's pretty invisible on the top there. So the goal of hem stitches is to make the stitching absolutely invisible. This is going to be with black thread on white, so just so you can see it. But if you're doing your own hems, you probably want to match the color of the thread as closely as possible to the color of your fabric so that it doesn't show. So to take the first stitch, we're going to go right behind where this locking stitch is on this side, which would be the side of your fabric, and try and grab just one thread. You want literally one thread. And then pull it through. So when you go to the other side, that's where that stitch is, and you can see it's pretty invisible even with contrast color thread. So do the second stitch, you move over a distance, and on the fold side it's not quite as important to only get one stitch, but it's good to work as close to the fold as you can, and holding your needle at a slight slant towards your non-dominant side. Again, reach to the back and pick up one thread of your garment. Just get one thread there. There we go. And then just sort of pull it. And we'll move over to the next one. Again, you move over a slight distance, pretty close to the fold. Reach in, grab one thread from the back. So again, your goal is to have the stitches look even so that the eye is tricked on the other side. So try and keep these about the same distance apart. They don't have to be super close together, but they shouldn't be too far apart either, because then your foot will catch in it or something will catch in it, and it will get ripped out. So again, you want to go through and get the smallest amount of thread that you can and pull it through. And you can see it's just starting to wrap around the edge here. And this is called a slip stitch because it just kind of slips around the fold there on your hem. Again, you slide it in at a slight angle towards your non-dominant side. You're working from the non-dominant side towards the dominant side. And you just pull it around. I'm going to show you the back again. And you can see that if that thread there was the same color as the fabric, it would be invisible. I'm going to pull my hem up here, and you can see that was done that way. And that's pretty much, you can't see it at all. It's just slip stitched right along the edge. And that's how you do a slip stitch. Okay, sometimes when you're sewing along, because of the needle is round, you can't tell which way you're holding it. It's going to roll in your hand. And then you get sort of like this twisted bit of thread, and it tends to knot as you go through. To get rid of that, stretch it out and just roll the needle in your fingers until it's out and even again. You can even, unwrap that until your thread is smooth again, and then it'll stop knotting as you go along. Now to end the slip stitch, take your last stitch. Do my last stitch here. Yeah. One thread. Actually got about 3 threads on that one, but it's alright. and then come back and do your locking stitches on the hem side, because this will be the inside of your hem. So either do your knot or your locking stitches where they're not going to show on the other side. And I'm going to flip this over in a second and show you what it looks like. And there's our nearly invisible hem. Like I say, if this was the same color fabric, the same color thread as the fabric, you wouldn't be able to see that at all. And that's how you do a slip stitch. Okay, we're going to be doing the catch stitch, or sometimes call it the wiggle stitch because of the way the needle moves. But you can see I folded up another pleat. That the fold doesn't quite, the outside fold doesn't quite reach the inside fold of this one to give me some room to work. And you're going to be doing another hem stitch after this, so make sure you leave yourself enough room. So to do the catch stitch, we're going to be catching the different sides of the fabric as we go by. It's why it's called the catch stitch. And I'm going to start with my two little things here. And notice I don't even have to go all the way through. This stitch is going to be invisible on both sides if it's done right. Now I don't know if I can do that using this gigantic. What did I do? I pierced it. I pierced the thread. That wasn't good. Be careful not to pierce your thread. Using this gigantic needle and this really thick thread, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this invisible, but I'm going to do my best. So now that the thread is fastened on the fold side, and you can see it's completely invisible from this side, I'm going to go over just a little bit from where that stitch was on this side of the fabric, which would be the top side of the garment. And I'm going to take a little tiny stitch, again trying to catch as few threads as possible. You can see I went from there to there, and now I'm going to go back to this side and do another little running stitch from the dominant side toward the non-dominant side. This is a variant of the running stitch. So you can see now I've caught here, and I've caught here, and I've caught here. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to catch this side again, just a little bit farther toward the non-dominant hand. Really hard to see working inside the fold here. But you can see this is going to be pretty invisible on this side as well. Now you can also, if you've got something, if you've got a garment that's lined and you've ripped out the top seam, or you want to close up a hole where you're turning something, this can be a really good invisible stitch to do. So you want to catch just a little bit again of the side on the fold, and a little bit farther down. I keep folded. And a little bit farther down, if you can see this, it's really hard to see what I'm doing here on the inside. And a little bit farther down on the other side. And then you don't even have to pull the needle out. You can just grab the next little bit on the way down, and grab a little bit on that side, and pull the needle through several stitches at once, just like you did with a running stitch. And you can see this is hidden inside the fold. It's catching one side, the other side, going up and down, and so the next stitch is here, so the last stitch is here, so the next stitch would start on this side. And you can see it's pretty invisible on this side, and it's completely invisible on that side. So you can work this again, like if you're turning a piece of something like a pillowcase or something, and you've got the two, you can just hold your edges together like this and work this in between them and pull it tight. And when you open it up, that stitch is going to be completely invisible. So that's the catch stitch. Okay, there's the catch stitch finished. See, I got a little deep with the knot on that side, but it's completely invisible from that side, and pretty darn near invisible from this side. This is, like I say, really thick thread. This is like 3 times the thickness of any thread you'll be using. So if this was regular sewing thread and the same color, that would be completely invisible. So you'd have a completely invisible seam from both sides. Okay, our next stitch is called the Herringbone Stitch, and you can see I've pleated up the fabric already for that. So this is another another hem stitch, and this one is worked from the non-dominant side toward the dominant side. So I'm working this one, I'm right-handed, so I'm working it from left to right. And again, you're going to want to lock your thread down in the corner with just a couple little stitches here. See, if you're not snipper, just pull it back a little bit and then it'll slide right through. Okay, I'm just going to hide that in the fold. Okay, now for a herringbone stitch, it's another variation on the running stitch, most of these are, and it's worked backwards like the back stitch, but not over itself. So you're going to go and you're going to take a tiny little back stitch, like you did. This one you don't have, this one you shouldn't do one thread, but you can just do like a tiny little bit. This one's going to show a little bit more whatever you do. Take a little back stitch like that, and pull it through. And you see it's going to cross. Again, you're going to make sure you keep the thread down towards you, and you're going to be making little X's. And you can make this little X right along the edge of the fold. So you just want to move over a reasonable stitch length and take a little back stitch like that. And then go toward the direction of your dominant hand and take another little back stitch, but on the other side. So again, you're crossing back and forth like you did with the catch stitch, but this time you're making little tiny X's. And you can do this right along the fold. I'll open it up a little bit so you can see the X's a little bit more clearly. This is actually being kind of hidden on the inside. I like to hide my herringbone stitch when I'm doing it. So I'm going to make the next ones up a little bit farther on the inside so you can see more what I'm doing. And you can just run this along the fold. And this stitch has a little more give to it because of the way you do this back stitch. So if your fabric's a little bit stretchy, this is a good way to do it because you have a little more give in the stitches than you do in something like a slip stitch that I did above. And again, you can do this on the outside so that it shows. It's a fairly invisible stitch, but not quite as invisible as some of these others. And it's certainly not invisible on the inside. On the inside, you'll definitely see it. Now this stitch is also an embroidery stitch. So if you look at my cuffs here, this is the exact same stitch. Coming up, doing that little X, and going up. So if you want to do this on the outside, you can do it very pretty. It's a very pretty stitch. So there we are with the little X's, crossing back and forth. You can see the cross X, 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 X. And that's a herringbone. Okay, this is an extreme close-up of the stitch. You can see I've got the needle going in from the dominant side toward the non-dominant side, taking a very small piece, and I've moved over from where the previous stitch was. So I'm just going to pull that through. And you can see that's going to form an X right there. Then I'm going to go to the fold side, about a stitch length down. I'm going to do another running stitch from the dominant side toward the non-dominant side, like that. I'm going to hold this thread out of the way and pull it through. And you can see it's going to make a little X right there. And then that makes an X coming up. So I'll make my little X, my little back stitch going this way, and pull it through on the back side. So if you get a little knot, you can just back it up a little bit and it'll come out. And then I'm going to do a little, move it along and make another little back stitch on the fold side. So what I have a line of little X's, alternating sides from the back side to the fold side, back side, fold side, back side, fold side. All these little X's as I go along. Okay, and here's the herringbone stitch done on the surface of the fold all the way along. And you see if you turn it over, it's not too blatant. It's pretty invisible. Again, if that was a matching thread, it wouldn't be too bad. Okay, now our last stitch that we're going to do is the buttonhole stitch. So you want to take your fabric and turn it over and pin down about a ½ inch or so along the back so you have a fold to work on. So we're going to take our thread and fasten it on quite close to the fold on the non-dominant side. This is another stitch that's worked from the non-dominant side toward the dominant side. So we're just going to do 2 little stitches here to lock the thread down. Okay, then we take our needle and we're going to put it behind the fold and bring it out a little ways down. And that this is the line you're going to make all the way across as the bottom. So make it a comfortable distance about where you want it. And you're going to pull your thread through, leaving a little loop on the top. You can see the loop there. You take your thread on the needle and you stick it back through the loop and tighten it gently so that you have a line of thread laying across the fold and a piece coming down. And you move over about this, and you're trying to make this all the same, and you come back up from underneath again, about the same distance down, and pull the thread through, leaving a loop on the top, and thread your needle through the loop, and pull it tight. And again, you've got your thread laying across the top, and your little stem coming down. This stitch can be used, it's called a buttonhole stitch because it can be used very close together. I mean, if you put these like right on top of each other, you could close an opening like that a button would go through all the time without it raveling. Or you can just use it as a decorative edge stitch on a facing or a armhole or something. Just fold the fabric over and tie it down. And again, you stick it through and leave a loop and pull it up. And you try and get these lines about the same distance down every time so that it looks even. You can use this again as a decorative stitch, and you could, I've seen it done where you have, a long and shorter and make it look sort of like an arc, but we're not going to do that. I'm not going to show you that one. You can look up buttonhole embroidery stitches online and see a whole bunch of them. So you push it in from the back, leave a loop at the top, slide your thread through, and give it a little tug to tighten it. Now if you find yourself having a hard time getting this in the same spot, feel free to take a ruler and a pencil and draw a line. You can draw a line on the inside where you won't see it, or you can draw it on the outside if it's something like chalk that'll just erase, or some kind of an erasable marker. And then you have a more even place to stick it through while you're learning how to make it fairly even. I'm going to do a fairly good job here making it even. Again, leave a little loop on the top, slide the needle through, and there's your buttonhole stitch. And you can see that holds the fabric down and makes a strong edge. Just stiff thread knots. There we go. And slide it through. And there's your buttonhole stitch. And it looks just about the same on either side. You have your stems coming down, your thread along the edge protecting it, and again the stems coming down. So if you had if this was being done on a raw edge, that would hold the threads in place so they wouldn't unravel. And there's your buttonhole. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is learn how to sew on a button. Now this is actually button and carpet thread, a buttonhole in carpet thread. So it's very strong. If you have that, feel free to sew your buttons on with it if it's not too heavy. I like to knot the ends of my buttons. Yes, you could just do it, but you know, it's already lumpy, so we're just going to knot it. I lick my finger to give it some traction, roll the thread around, roll it down, and give it a little slide with my fingernail, and that puts a knot on the bottom that I can then trim off quite short, close to the knot, so it's as least globby as it needs to be. So you're going to want to mark where your buttons go and push your needle up to do it. Now this button here is a type that's called a shank, built-in shank button. If you look, it's got a little plastic loop, bevel colored, underneath, and that holds the button off of the fabric. If you sew the button flat to the fabric, you will never be able to put it in the buttonhole. So if you have this shank here, holds the button off the fabric so that a button can slide easily into the buttonhole. So take your needle and pull it through your fabric, insert the needle into the shank, into the hole of the shank, and then go back and take a little tiny running stitch right on top of where your knot was. And pull the button tight. And you can pull it tight because you've got the shank in there. Then feed the needle back through the shank. I can see that. Oops. Tip the button up. Take another little running stitch right in the same spot. Doesn't matter if they just go over each other. And again back through the shank. And you want to do this 3, 4, 5 times until it looks like there's a sufficient amount. This is, like I say, very thick thread, so I'm only going to do it twice. To finish off, you take the needle and you put it close to that where you came up. Push it to the back of the fabric. Again, you're going to take another little running stitch. And then leaving a loop, you're going to put the needle through the loop and pull it tight. And you can do that more than once if you want to. I wouldn't do it more than twice, but you can do it twice if you want to. And then that can be cut off pretty close to there. And there's your button, nice and firmly sewed on with the shank. So you can do that. Now, there's other kinds of buttons. There's buttons with 2 holes. And there's buttons with 4 holes. And these get sewn on just a little bit differently than the shank buttons do anyway. So I'm going to grab somewhere I had. Okay, so for this one, this is just regular sewing thread. This is not buttonhole thread. So this is just the regular sewing thread. And I'm going to double it up. I'm going to even out the ends. I'm going to put a knot in the bottom, wrap it around my finger, slide my fingernail down, there gives me a knot. Now you're going to have to make your own shanks when you make these buttons. Because again, if you sew them flat right onto the fabric, there is no way that you will easily be able to put this button in a buttonhole. So there's 2 ways when you've got a 2-hole button. You can either line the holes up parallel to the edge or perpendicular to the edge, and you have to decide which way is going to look best. So I'm going to do these perpendicular to the edge. I'm going to put my thread up and pull it to the knot, and I'm going to slide it up through the hole in the button and push it back down through the other hole. So I have a little loop of thread going through the button. Now the trick is to keep your finger in between so that that button never goes flat to the fabric. So then I push it back into the fabric, a little bit about the width of the holes away, and pull it down, but again, not flat to the fabric. You want to keep a finger's gap in there. This is really hard to show. And then I come up in the same, just about the same hole that I went in the first time, and back up through the hole in the button. and back down through the other hole into the fabric. Again, keeping my finger in there so that I'll be able to make a thread shank on this button. So we're going to do that 3 or 4 times. We go back up through the button, back down, keeping my finger in there, and these threads fairly close together on the back. And I'm going to do this one more time. Up and around. Now the last time, I'm not going to go back down into the fabric. I'm just going to take the needle, oops, and put it through the button and pull it through, but not down into the fabric. At this point, I'm going to hold the button and I'm going to wrap this fabric around, wrap this thread around 3 or 4 times and pull it tight. And that gives me a shank on the button. And then I put the thread into the fabric for the last time. Come on. Straight into the fabric for the last time. And I can make my little knots on the bottom. Now this button will definitely go through buttonholes and will not be a struggle because you have that little gap in there. So there we go. Button sewn on, holes running parallel to the side, but it's a little bit dangly right now because there's not the other layers of thread and the other layers of fabric in there that would be on the other side holding it together. So we're going to cut that off and we're going to move right to the 4-hole button. Going to knot the end of this thread.
Start.
Okay, for a 4-hole button, I've knotted my thread. I'm going to come up on my mark and through one of the holes in the button. Now you can either sew these this way, parallel to the edge, or you can sew it perpendicular to the edge. So I could go in this hole or I could go in this hole. So just decide which way you want your threads to run and do it consistently. So I'm going to do this one again. I'm going to do this one parallel just to show you the difference of what it looks like. We'll slide that in there. And again, you want to keep your finger in there. In fact, you need to keep it a little bit more distance on a 4-hole button than you do on a 2-hole button because more thread has to get pulled onto the inside. So then come up on the back a little bit over from your button, from your first one, and come up through the 3rd hole, and then go down through the 4th hole. And come up through the 1st hole, and down through the 2nd, up through the 3rd, down through the 4th, and you want to do that 3 or 4 times. I'm going to stop now just for quickness. Again, you're going to, for the last stitch, you're going to put the needle through just the button. You're going to wrap it around 3 or 4 times. Give it a tug. Put it down to the back. And put a little knot in there. That you can then trim off. And there's the button. Again, there's a little thread shank. And it holds it that way. So there's the 3 buttons. So thank you very much for taking the class. I want to thank Mistress Grazia Giralda, who originally asked me to be her literal right-handed demonstrator. And she gave me the ideas, and I hope you've enjoyed the class. If you have any questions, I do suggest you download the documentation. It's 18 pages of lots of pictures, and it has my contact information on it if you have any questions. So thank you so much. Have a good sewing. Bye-bye.